Hello folks, so in this video I'm going to be going through the code that I used for creating Breakout in Pygame. I'll run the code first to show you what it looks like. So you can see I've got my paddle, I can move it left and right with the arrow keys, and the ball goes up and knocks down the bricks. So the bricks are in different colors and the colors correspond to their strength. So the red bricks, they break with just one hit, whereas the green ones, they take 2 and the blue ones take 3. So as you can see, as soon as I hit a green one, it loses a life essentially, and it goes to a red brick. So I've got collision working and everything's set up in there. So I'll jump straight into the actual code and I'll start programming this game. So as always, start off with the usual module imports. So import Pygame from Pygame local, from Pygame locals, import star. And then you have to initialize Pygame. And after that, I create the game window. So I define a couple of variables for that. Screen width is 600 and screen height is also 600. So I'm going to have a square game window. So then I can create my screen. And the screen is going to be called with the function of pygame.display.set_mode. And then I just feed in those two variables, screen width and screen height. And after that, I want to give this window a title. So I'm going to call the function pygame.display.set_caption. And I'm going to call this game Breakout. Now with that defined, I can create my game loop. So as always, I set an initial running condition, which I will set to true. And then I'll use a while loop for my main game loop. So while run, which means that as long as run is true, then we execute all the code that's within here. And now I want to have the option to exit the game, so I use event handlers. And I use a for loop for that. So for event in pygame.event.get, which means it's going to look for all the Pygame events, and I'm going to be looking for a particular one. So if event type is pygame.quit, which is when the X button is clicked in the top right corner of the window, then I set the run variable to false, and that alone is enough to exit this while loop. So once that's happened, I can finalize the code by saying pygame.quit. So that essentially is the complete code. If I run this now just to check, there, so I have my game window, it's all blank at the moment, and I've got the title set at the top. So the next thing I want to do is add a background color. So I'll come up here and I'll define initial colors. And the color I had used for this, I'm just going to copy what I had already in the code. So it was 234.218.184. And normally in some of the games I've coded before, I create a specific function for drawing my background. But in this occasion, I don't really have much to draw on it other than the background color. So I can just come straight into the game loop, and I'm just going to fill the entire background with this BG color. And for that, I'm going to call my screen, which is my display window, and I'm going to call the function fill. Provide the color BG, and that will fill it with that color. But that alone is not enough to actually update the screen. So for that, we need to call another function. And that is pygame.display.update. So if I run this now, you can see I've got that background color filling in now. So what I'm going to move on to next is creating all those bricks. So that brick wall is the next part. Before I do that, I want to define some more colors. So these are going to be my block colors. And again, these ones I'd predetermined before. So these are just whatever I used when I made the game originally. So my red one is going to be this. Then I'm going to define a green color, 86.174.87, and lastly my blue bricks, 69.177. And the good thing about this is you can pretty much just play around with these colors as much as you want, and that is what I did. I played around with them all until I eventually got to ones that I liked. So that's my colors defined. I now want to define a few game variables. And the two that I need right now are the number of columns and the number of rows. So my calls, I'm going to have 6 columns, and my rows, I'm going to have 6 rows. And as always with something like this, I'm going to be using classes. So I will define my brick wall class, and this will be class wall. So the first function is always the init function, and this is just going to take an argument of self. So I don't actually need to supply any additional arguments to it. I have my columns and my rows defined globally, and that's all I'm going to use within this function, as well as my colors. So the only things that I need then are a width and a height for each of these bricks. The width I want to be determined by the number of columns, because I want that to essentially stretch to the size of the screen. So at the moment I've defined my screen width and the number of columns. So I will just say screen width divided by the number of columns. And the reason I used this for the division is so that I don't get any decimal points. So this is going to be an integer value. And that means that I can change the number of columns and I can change the screen width, and it's going to adjust accordingly. The height, I'm just going to set that to 50 pixels. So the next function I want to define is the one that actually creates the wall. Define create wall, and again I don't need any arguments in here, so it's just going to be self. Now this bit's a little bit tricky. So the way that this wall is going to be created, it has a color and it has a rectangle. So each of these bricks is going to be saved as a Pygame rectangle. So I will create a list, and in each of these lists I'm going to contain the rectangle position of each brick, as well as the number of lives it has, which is then going to determine its color. Once I've created each individual brick, I will create another list above that, which will house each row. And then when I've created each row, I'm then going to create a final list for the entire wall, which is going to take all of the rows and stack them on top of each other. So it's maybe a little bit confusing, but I'll type it out and it will make a bit more sense. So first of all, self.blocks is my list that covers the entire wall. So this is going to house all of the blocks that I'm going to be making. So first of all, I want to define an empty list for an individual block. And I will call this block individual equals empty list. So now I want to iterate through each of the rows in each of the columns and individually create a brick for each of those points. I'll use a for loop for that. For row in range of rows, meaning that it's going to iterate through this value of 6. I need to now create my block row list. Reset the block row list. Block row is an empty list. So I have now created my individual list. So this is going to house each of the bricks. This is going to contain all of those bricks and create a row out of them. And then finally, once I've created each row, I'm going to append it to my overall block list. So I'll carry on and it will make a bit more sense soon. So now I want to iterate through each of my columns. Oops, I missed an end there. I'm iterating at the moment through the rows, and then I want to iterate down the way. So for call in range calls, and at this point, so I'm iterating first of all through the rows. So let's say I begin with the first row, and then I start moving through the columns in that row. So it's going to be the very top left brick, and then the brick to the right of that, and then the brick to the right of that one. So for each of these bricks, I want to define an X and a Y coordinate for them. And that's what I'm going to store in my rectangle object. So I'll add a little comment here, generate X and Y positions for each block and create a rectangle from that. Okay, so block X, and I want this to change with the column that I'm at. So every time this iterates, I want it to increase by the width of each of these bricks. So as I iterate through that column, the x value is going to increase brick by brick. So they all start 1 over from each other. So my block x is going to be column times self dot width. And the block, and then the block y is the same, but it's row times self dot height. Alright, so this is now creating an x and a y coordinate for each one of these bricks. Now I need to create a rectangle from that. So my rect is going to be saved as this variable, and I'm going to be using Pygame's rect function. So first it takes an x coordinate, which is block x, then block y, and then I need to give it a width and a height, which I already have. Self width and self height. Okay, so that's created every one of those rectangles. Now I just need to assign them a strength, which, if you remember, is what's going to determine the color of each of them. So assign block strength based on row. So I've got the strongest bricks at the top, and then as it goes down, the bricks get weaker. So I'm just going to be looking at what row we're in. So as I'm iterating through these rows, I just want to see which one I'm in, and depending on that one, I'm going to assign a strength. So if row is less than 2, so if we're right at the top of the brick wall, then I want the strongest ones there. So strength is 3. Else if row is less than 4, then strength is going to be 2. Oops, that's a little typo there. And I'll just copy this down for the last one. So lastly, if the row is less than 6, then this is going to be the weakest of the bricks, strength 1. Okay, so I'm nearly done with this for loop here. So essentially what I've done is I've created a rectangle for each of these bricks as I've been iterating through them. I've now assigned a strength to it. So all that's left is to save this inside that individual brick list. So create a list at this point to store the rectangle and the color data. So the color, or rather the strength, defines the color that I'm going to be using afterwards. So block individual, which was defined originally as an empty list, this is going to have my rect, which I've just created for this individual brick, and the strength for that individual brick. And now that I've created this, I can append it. I can append that individual block to my overall block row. Block row, and the reason I mean, you could do this in other ways, but I really like using lists because there are a lot of functions that are built into Python that make working with lists quite easy. So this is one of them. I'm going to append, essentially I'm going to attach this individual brick to my row of bricks. So block row dot append block individual. And lastly, once I've gone through this entire loop, this entire for iteration, it means that I've finalized and I've created a whole row. So when I've created a whole row, I want to add that to my overall blocks list, which contains every single one of the bricks. So another note here, append the row to the full list of blocks. Self.blocks, because this is going to be part of the instance of this class. Again, I'll use the append function, and I will attach that row list. Okay, so quite a bit of code there. Now that it's complete, if you revisit this, it may make a bit more sense. But essentially, all I am doing is creating a rectangle with, or rather, I'm creating an individual list which contains the features of a particular brick. And then I'm going through that entire row of bricks, creating a new list which covers that row. And then I'm attaching each row into my overall self.blocks list. So now that I've gone through and had a function for creating the wall, well, I now need to output this wall onto the screen. And for that, I'm going to define a second function. This is going to be define draw wall. And again, it doesn't need to take anything apart from self. So now I again need to iterate through everything, and I'm just going to be iterating through this blocks list that I created earlier. So for row in blocks, so essentially move through each of the rows within that list, and then within that list look for each individual block. Okay, so first of all, this is going to be giving me each row, and then I'm going to be iterating through each of those rows and going one by one through each block. And now I can look into the values of that individual block and assign a color based on block strength. So at this point, block is going to be giving me this. For each of the bricks, I'm going to be getting this value. So from that, I'm looking for the strength value. And based on the strength value, I'm choosing a color. So if block, and again, this is another feature of lists, I'm able to access this point. So both of these have an index value within the list. So block 0, if I type block 0, that's going to access this here, and it's going to give me the details of the rectangle. But I want the strength value, so I'm going to say block 1. If this is equal to 3, then this is the strongest block. So I want to set the block color to blue, which I defined previously. And now I copy this down because I'm just going to be repeating this for the other two strengths. I'll just change it to else if this is equal to 2, then I want green squares, green rectangles, and if it's 1, then I want red ones. So now with the color defined, and keep in mind I'm still within my for loop, so I'm still looking at each individual block, I can now draw them. For this I'm going to use pygame.draw.rect. So the first value I need to supply is the game window that I'm putting this onto, which in my case I've already created as screen. Then I need to give it a color, and this is going to be block call, which I've determined from this section of if and elifs above. And then I need to define, or I need to give it the rectangle. So if you remember, my individual block has a rect within this list, and I still have access to that. So all I'm needing here is block, except instead of 1, it's going to be block 0. So I'm going to access the first index. So now with all of this defined, I can come down here and I can actually create finally an instance of this wall. So this is going to be an instance of my class. So wall equals an instance of the wall class. And now that I've created an instance of it, I can call the function style within it. So the one I want to call is create wall. And that's going to run through all of this code here, and it's going to create that list. So that's fine, but it's not actually showing it on the screen. So for that I need to come in here, and where I've already got my screen fill with the background color, below that I can say draw wall, and I can call that instance, and now I can call the other function, which is draw wall. Okay, so that was quite a lot of typing. I'll run the game and see if this works. And I've made a typo somewhere. Yes, I missed a T. Okay, try that again. And I made another mistake, because I missed an S there. Okay, third time lucky. So you can see it's created all of the blocks, but they've kind of just blended into one, and they are there separated, but I haven't got anything to split them up. And there's an easy way of doing that. I'm going to come into the draw wall section, and I'm just going to add a border. So I will draw another rectangle. So it's going to be pygame.draw.rect, so exactly the same function, screen, and the color that I want to use now is the background color. Then I need to give it the rectangle, so it's going to be exactly the same position and width and height as the original. But if I was to run this now, it's just going to fill over. So I will run it just to show. So what's happening first is it's drawing all of my individual colored bricks or blocks, and then after that it's going over it and it's drawing the same blocks but in the background color. So essentially just covering them up. So I don't want it to be filled. And what I'm going to do to avoid that is add another variable or another argument, and this is going to be the line thickness. If I run this now, you can see it looks like it's created little borders between all of the blocks, but actually all that's happened is I've drawn rectangles on top of my existing rectangles, and they're just not solidly filled. So what you're seeing, this outline here, is just these new rectangles that I've drawn. And you can change this value here as much as you want, and it's just going to make that thicker. So you're going to end up with slightly smaller blocks. I'll change it back to 2. I think it looks quite good that way. So that's pretty much it for this first video. If you find this useful, then please leave a like, and if you want to stay up to date with the next videos and the next tutorials, then please feel free to subscribe. Alright, thanks for watching.